So tonight, I'm honored to welcome author and financial expert Steven Rattner, who is with us to discuss Overhaul, an insider's account of the Obama administration's emergency rescue of the auto industry. Of Overhaul, Kirkus Review writes that Obama auto czar Rattner delivers a vigorous account of the bailout of the automobile industry, a success, though one fraught with controversy, a fine inside baseball account of how things can get done when people agree to get them done, even in Washington. And from Slate magazine, Overhaul is a compelling story about how government reacts to economic crisis. Rattner's book is an extraordinary account of how government, brandishing the stick of bankruptcy, was able in a few months to accomplish tremendous restructuring of a major American industry in ways that had eluded the private sector for half a century or more. His material on GM's clueless management is truly priceless. Mr. Rattner was the U.S. Treasury Auto Industry Advisor for the Obama administration. Prior to that, he was managing principal of Quadrangle Group. Mr. Rattner was previously employed at the New York Times as an economic correspondent, and his work can be found in publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the Financial Times. We are thrilled to have him with us this evening, so will you please join me in welcoming Steven Rattner.
Thanks so much. So I was suggested that I talk a little bit about how I came to write this book and my experience in Washington, and then just read a little bit from the very beginning about it. So I was asked to become the head of the President-elect Obama's task force soon after the election in November of 2008, actually really closer to the end of the year. And they raised with me a few different things that I might do in Washington, one of them being autos. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know anything about autos. And I said to them, I don't know anything about autos. And they said, we know, but you're a Wall Street guy. This is a restructuring job. It's not an auto job. And we'd love to have you come and figure this mess out. You'll all recall that in the fall of 2008, GM and Chrysler essentially ran out of money, showed up at the door of the Bush administration, asked for a bailout, were given $17 billion right at the end of 2008 to kind of tide them over, but nothing fundamentally had been done to restructure the companies or figure out what to do with the companies going forward. And so I spent some time agonizing over whether to take that job. My name sort of leaked out. There was an enormous amount of criticism of me from Michigan Democrats, oddly enough, who basically said that I was a New York Wall Street guy and I couldn't possibly understand the auto business and they needed somebody who could. And I sort of froze in my tracks and was pretty terrified about the whole thing. I didn't know how to solve the problem. It looked like an insoluble problem from where I was sitting in New York. But after sort of close to 6 weeks of agonizing and discussing and thinking about it, I finally literally kind of closed my eyes and jumped and just said, it's a big problem. They want me to come and help. If I don't do it, somebody else will have to, and I might as well give it a chance. And I actually kind of thought to myself, it can't get any worse by my being there than it is already. And so I shouldn't get blamed if this doesn't work out. Everybody knows it's an impossible problem. And so I took the job, and as I said, knew nothing about the auto business, thought I knew a little bit about Washington, thought I knew some things about finance, but had really no idea of how we were going to attack this problem. And I got down there and found there was no staff to speak of. There had been a couple people from the Bush administration who had spent some time on it. They had gone home. There's no Department of Autos in the U.S. government. There's no auto expertise. There was no analysis. There was no nothing. We literally just inherited nothing, except two companies that were about to run out of money again, that were required to submit by February 17th of 2009 their so-called viability plans for how they were going to become profitable again, and a requirement that by March 31st of 2009 we determine whether they could be viable and how they'd become viable. And it was really, as I said, I thought I knew a little bit about Washington from having been quite involved in politics over the years, but it was quite a shock to my system to get down there and find that unlike the private sector, you can't just go hire people. There's enormous process and rules and bureaucracy around hiring people. You can't just do stuff. You've got to deal with all the different agencies and constituencies that have a point of view. And when I went in to see, at one point when I was having lots of trauma about whether to take the job, and I was sitting with Larry Summers, who became one of my two bosses, and I said, look, among other things, I have no idea how to hire people or who I can hire or what we can do. And he said, well, how many people would you need? And I said, well, if we were doing this in the private sector, we'd want 50 people to restructure all these companies. But I knew full well that that was not going to be a viable number. So I said, well, in the government context, maybe 15. And he was head of the National Economic Council, as I'm sure you all know. And he said, well, my whole staff's only 19 people. And I said, well, that may be, but we need 15 people to do this. And he wasn't in a position to say yes or no. He said, sure, we'll work it out. And it was just kind of like that, a whole series of impediments of one sort or another. The government has incredibly strict conflict of interest rules, and President Obama had layered a whole set of his own conflict of interest rules on top of it, meaning that we weren't allowed to hire anybody who knew anything, essentially. We were only allowed to hire people who didn't know anything, and that anybody who knew anything was conflicted out. We even tried to hire one person who had given some free advice to the UAW, and that was viewed as a conflict. So we ended up having to scramble for who to bring in and kind of cobble together a team. But when the dust settled, we had assembled about 15 people, coincidentally. I really had pulled that number out of the air, but we ended up being, I think, 14 to be precise, of people who really came mostly from Wall Street or had been on Wall Street and who really wanted to serve. These were people, most of whom had jobs, not all of them, but most of whom gave up their lives, their jobs, their families, and came to Washington to take on what appeared to be both a thankless and nearly impossible task. And to work obviously at government wages and under government conditions as well. And we ended up having a terrific group of people. I called it a team of rivals because all of our hiring was done without regard to political persuasion or anything, and we ended up having some pretty staunch Republicans and some quite liberal Democrats and everything in between, and some people who were pretty apolitical but really just saw this as a chance to serve, as I did. I mean, I essentially said to myself, this is a problem that may be insoluble, but I've got a reasonable chance of helping if anybody can help. And if I don't do this, what am I saving myself for? Why? This is a financial crisis and an economic crisis, and we all have an obligation to serve. So we all sort of took that leap together and plunged in. And my appointment was announced February 23rd. And as I said, we had till March 31st essentially to figure out what to do with these companies. And so it became a 24-hour day exercise essentially to come up with it. I would say, let me make a couple of broad points about the ultimate outcome and how we thought about it that you can all think about, and then I'll talk a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then I'll read a little bit, and then we'll open it up. There are really only, for those of you who don't want to read the whole book, there's really only 2 or 3 things you have to know, and then you can tell everybody you read the book, and they will believe you. But you should still buy it anyway. One is that, contrary to what you may hear from other people, if the government had not stepped in, these companies would have liquidated, closed their doors, and a couple million people would have been out of work. There was no private capital available. There was no other source of financing, and they were running out of money. And if GM and Chrysler had closed their doors, the suppliers would have closed their doors. If the suppliers had closed their doors, Ford would have had to stop producing cars because they couldn't gotten parts. And Honda and Toyota and Nissan and all the other foreign companies that manufacture in the U.S. would have had to close their doors, and all the dealers would have been out of work, and all the people who supply these companies with non-automotive things, whether it's messenger services or restaurants or anything, would have been severely affected. So it would have been an economic meltdown for the Midwest and indeed nationally of enormous proportion. So people who say, well, the government should have just stayed out of it and let the market work, it was just not possible. The second thing I would say is that without the existence of TARP, the same thing would have happened. TARP has become the program everybody loves to hate. If you follow this campaign, certainly most Republicans and many Democrats on the campaign trail trash TARP and trash bailouts. But without TARP, we could not have written $82 billion of checks that we wrote to these companies. We would have had to go to Congress. Congress would never have acted. One of my big takeaways from my time in Washington was how dysfunctional Congress is, and at least one of these companies, if not both of them, would have had to shut down before Congress woke up and sort of dealt with this the way it should have. The third thing to think about or to keep in mind or to know is that I went down there hoping that we would be able to do the right thing, but assuming that this was a political environment, and I knew a little bit about politics, and assumed that we would ultimately have to massage things into a political context in terms of the constituencies that were important to the president and that were important to other people on the Hill and so forth. And I was really happy to see that the ultimate decision from the president on down, through Rahm Emanuel, through Larry Summers, through Tim Geithner, was to do the right thing. And we were never once told to favor one stakeholder, whether it be the UAW or anybody else, over another. We were always told to do the right thing and to do this the way we would do it if we were still in the private sector. And so as I look at what got done, there's very little, if anything, that I would have done differently or that I would change if I were still doing this in a Wall Street context. And I really believe at this time when bailouts are so unpopular and when the president's accused of being too political, I really do think that he deserves enormous credit here for having essentially stood behind us as we administered some very tough medicine. He said in his speech on March 31st, and we repeated it ad nauseum, that this needed to be shared sacrifice, and we ultimately enforced shared sacrifice. And we also did it in a way that created companies that are truly viable. General Motors used to need 16 million cars a year to be sold in the U.S. in order to just break even, a number that we've only rarely reached. At the bottom of the recession, we were selling about 9 million cars a year in the U.S., and we reduced GM's cost structure so much that they could break even at 10 to 12 million cars a year and could make money at anything above that. And so this year, when we're selling a little bit less than 12 million cars, probably, GM has had 2 quarters of profit for the first time in 3 or 4 years. So it's worked. We have now companies that are viable. We have suppliers that are viable. We have dealers that are viable. And while a lot of people, unfortunately, had to lose their jobs to create that kind of an environment, a lot more people got to keep their jobs, and we managed to preserve an important part of America's manufacturing base. So I feel really good about the outcome, and that is a large part of why I chose to write this book, because I felt that this was an historic moment in American capitalism. We didn't want to intervene in these companies. We were drafted. We didn't volunteer. We were just forced into it by circumstance. Larry particularly emphasized that our job was to get in and get out. It was sort of the opposite of Vietnam. We were supposed to get in and get out as quickly as possible, and the government will get out relatively quickly, and certainly as quickly as possible. And I felt that this was an example of where government actually can play a constructive role when private markets fail, when you are facing an extraordinary economic collapse. This is what government is for. And so I felt that it was a story that should be told. And I had read a fair number of accounts of what we did in the auto rescues, and felt that while a lot of them were very good, and many of which I tried to help and make sure they were accurate, there's always a difference between being in the room and not being in the room in terms of just the feeling, the nuance, and really a sense of what was going on. Another reason why, a couple of reasons why I wrote the book. I mean, one was that I had been a journalist, as you heard, a long time ago, and always wanted to write a book, but never had the subject or the discipline or the time. And so sort of one of those things on my personal list that I was hoping to do someday. But I also felt that while I thought I knew something about Washington, it was still interesting to go there as an employee, as a government worker, and see it from the inside, and see both the good and the bad of government, how it works, how it doesn't work. And so I didn't keep a single note. I never thought I was going to actually write this book, and I just was working so hard I didn't have time to keep a note or a diary anyway. But as I thought back on it, there were just lots of moments, big and small, that I thought were really kind of interesting about how government does and doesn't work, and thought that as a newcomer. And I remember when I was leaving, I said to Larry, I might write something about this. And he said, well, you're probably better positioned to write that than I would be, because I've been in government so long, I've sort of gotten immune to all the eccentricities of government, but you're new and you have fresh eyes. And so, yeah, you should. And so I tried to sort of convey for people in this book what it was like to be in government and what it was like to be in the middle of something like this, and the sort of day-to-day, the mundane aspects of life, the fact, for example, that there was literally no budget in the Treasury to buy a bottle of water for anybody who came to see us. We had to sort of buy them personally, things like that, to the larger things, which is really the enormous power of government when it chooses to pull itself together and do something. So that's what I tried to do in this book, and I tried to be very fair and, I guess to coin a phrase, fair and balanced about conveying, as candidly as I thought was appropriate, because I think some of what went on there was private, but convey as candidly as I thought was appropriate how this process worked and how the president came to make his decisions, and how we thought about it, and what the outcomes were, which, as I said, I think were quite good. GM is going to go public in mid-November, and I hope when that happens, I'm relatively sure it will be very successful, and I hope at that moment people will begin to understand better than they seem to at the moment how successful this was and how important this was that we undertake it. So with that said, I thought I would just read the very beginning of this, and then happy to take everybody's questions. So this begins on March 30th, which was the night, or March 29th, which is the night before the president's first speech. I mentioned that we had this deadline of March 31st, that we had to tell the world what we were going to do, and I had arrived, as I said, officially February 23rd. I'd actually been working a little bit before that, and we were scurrying around trying to come up with a set of proposals for the president. We'd had a series of meetings with the president the few days before, all this leading up to the speech. And so the night before, we gathered in the Oval Office, and I'll just start to read. The Oval Office has no proper waiting room, only a small anteroom in which President Obama's body person, Reggie Love, and his secretary, Katie Johnson, are usually seated. Against the wall is a small TV normally used to monitor news channels. But on this Sunday evening, near the end of March 2009, it was tuned to the Arnold Palmer Invitational Golf Tournament, where Tiger Woods, then still heroic, was making a long-awaited return from knee surgery. A few minutes before 7:30, a handful of us from the President's Auto Industry Task Force had followed Chief Economic Advisor Larry Summers down a narrow flight of red-carpeted stairs and along a short corridor to this room. We'd spent the past hour in the rabbit warren of offices on the second floor of the West Wing, reviewing once more the key documents for a nationally televised announcement President Obama was to make the next day, the 70th of his presidency. For Obama, this would be among his first major public actions. For our little task force, it was the point of no return. Since the task force's hasty formation in February, we had been meeting with General Motors and Chrysler, both of which were being fed intravenously with taxpayers' cash. Dozens of consultants, investment bankers, and other outside experts had presented their views, and the question of what the government should do with the struggling automakers had been debated extensively up the administration chain of command. Finally, in tense meetings at the White House a few days before, the president had made his decisions. Those decisions had remained secret until now. Tonight, he would call the Michigan lawmakers to alert them to what he was planning to say the next day. The president hadn't come downstairs from his living quarters yet, giving us a few minutes to root for Tiger's comeback. For me, a welcome distraction from worrying about whether our plans for the largest government intervention in industrial America since World War II could work. We had had only 5 frenzied weeks to prepare for this moment. One more time, I mentally reviewed those plans, which included additional billions in taxpayer funding for General Motors and Chrysler, and several other controversial and risky measures. What could go wrong, I'd asked myself over and over. As a prime mixer of the strong medicine that the president was about to administer, I was sure that if disaster ensued, all eyes would be on me. In particular, I worried about the much-discussed prospect of putting the automakers into, quote, controlled bankruptcy, unquote, a radical approach that defied conventional wisdom. While the president's speech the next day would leave open the possibility that bankruptcies might be avoided, I knew that the mere mention of it, let alone actually taking the step, risked imploding the auto companies, crippling thousands of related businesses, vaporizing millions of jobs, and intensifying what was already a deep recession across the Midwest. With America in the midst of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, this was no hyperbole. The failure of the auto companies could endanger the economy in ways that were almost too frightening to contemplate. The president arrived a few minutes late. Tiger was playing a particularly crucial hole, dressed in khakis and a black zipper jacket. I was not surprised that he was wearing casual clothes. I had on khakis myself. Since President Obama's arrival in the White House, shirt sleeves had become the Oval Office norm, and on weekends almost anything went, even T-shirts and jeans worn by unshaven, sockless men. While his dress was informal, the president's mood was resolute. He had the air of a man in the business of calmly executing his decisions, not second-guessing them. After he chatted briefly with Reggie about the golf match, we followed him into the Oval Office, where he sat behind his desk, bare but for a folder of talking points for his calls. Katie dialed him first into a conference line on which 4 lawmakers awaited, Michigan's 2 senators and 2 of its congressmen. Delegations from our task force had been meeting with them, tense, often testy sessions in which we were lectured about the importance of helping this critical industry. We clustered around a phone across the room from the president's desk by the armchair in front of the fireplace where he sat during meetings. Katie had activated the phone's speakers so we would all be able to listen in, but it barely functioned. Probably installed by a well-connected government contractor, the president joked. He worked through his talking points, fluidly detailing the next day's announcements. Then he paused to let the legislators speak. John Dingell, the longest-serving member of the House of Representatives in history, was gracious and statesmanlike. The others were audibly on edge, although considerably more polite and restrained in conversation with the president than they had been in their meetings with us. Congressman Sandra Levin seemed to interpret the president's allusions to bankruptcy for GM and Chrysler as just a negotiating tactic. I understand that you have to refer to bankruptcy to get people to the table, he began. The president interrupted in a measured tone. I don't want you to leave with that impression. I'm telling you that because it's a real possibility. At this, a chorus of anxious voices crackled through the speaker. Senator Debbie Stabenow urged that if the president was going to send such a tough message, he ought to couple it with a strong statement of support for the auto industry. Senator Levin beseeched him not to use such a broad brush in criticizing the companies and to acknowledge the progress the companies had made. The president listened carefully. When he brought the call to a close after about 30 minutes, he asked Larry to take another look at the speech. By the following morning, we'd responded by sanding down the criticism of the companies and adding the Cash for Clunkers program to bolster car sales. The next call was to Governor Jennifer Granholm of Michigan. I'd gotten to know her as an energetic, dynamic candidate during her 2006 campaign, but Michigan was suffering the nation's highest unemployment rate, and in our more recent conversations, she'd seemed beaten down and demoralized. Now, as she listened to the president outline his plans, her spirits seemed to fall further, and her voice barely rose above a whisper. I hope you know what you're doing, she said softly. During the final call, Ron Gettelfinger, head of the United Auto Workers, who had been defiant the previous autumn when Detroit first asked for federal help, was low-key and respectful now. This augured well for the tough discussions we knew we needed to have with him. When his calls were completed, the president walked out of the Oval Office and back to the small TV to learn that Tiger had hit a birdie putt on the 18th hole to win. Tiger's day may have ended, but for the task force, a night of work was just beginning. Thank you. Oh, yes. The question is that I spent a long time on Wall Street, and would I like to share my views of the current culture of Wall Street and whether that has changed at all over the years. I don't think anyone can doubt or disagree that there have been a lot of excesses on Wall Street, some loss of sort of balance and equilibrium in terms of what are considered to be good or appropriate business practices. And I think that many of the changes, if not all the changes that are being put in place now to provide better regulatory oversight, to provide higher capital requirements for banks, to change pay practices on Wall Street. I don't think anybody on Wall Street could sensibly disagree that a lot, if not all of these changes are necessary. I do think that, rightly or wrongly, for better or for worse, people need to recognize that people go to work on Wall Street generally for one major reason, which is to make money. You know, that may be good, that may be bad, but that's just the reality of it. And that's what they're trained to do, that's what they're incented to do, that's what their orientation is to do. And I don't even really fault them for trying to do that. I think you then need to have a set of rules that prevent it from running off the rails or off the road the way it did. I think the financial services industry is an enormously important part of our nation's economy. It's one of our great success stories, along with technology, entertainment, media, a few other businesses where we are still globally dominant, even while we're less dominant in other areas. And so I think the last thing we should want to do is kill Wall Street or impair its ability to compete responsibly and so forth. And so I think you have to find a middle ground. I think there are some people on Wall Street who get that and who recognize that things got out of control and who have committed themselves to a different course of conduct going forward. I would say to you candidly, there are probably a larger number of people on Wall Street who don't get it and don't understand why everybody's mad at them and don't think anybody should be mad at them. And I think they will simply have to be managed to behave and perform in an appropriate way. So the question is about the hiring rules and the restrictions it placed on us to hire anybody who knew anything, and whether I felt there was any movement in a more flexible direction to fix that, and whether it had any impact ultimately on what we did. So there are a couple sets of rules. As I said, there are some that are a matter of law. For example, you can't have a financial interest in any company that would be affected by what you did. Those are law. Those have been around for a long time. They're not going to change. They shouldn't change. They do create complexity because many of the people who know something do have financial holdings in this industry or these companies and may not be willing to divest or to get themselves to be in a position where they're compliant. But those are the same rules we operate on Wall Street with, and those are fair. What President Obama put in place, which was really designed to capture lobbyists, but I don't know that they fully understood what the implications were, was a set of rules that said if you had worked for or had an involvement with any entity that you would then be dealing with as part of your government service within the prior year or two, there were some that 1 year, some of these were 1 and some were 2 year restrictions, then you couldn't be hired, period, without a waiver from the White House. And when the Obama people first came, they did give a couple of waivers, and there was a lot of public negative reaction to that, so they stopped giving waivers. So in fact, if anything, it went the wrong way, at least during my time there, in terms of them. They came in as the new sheriff. They said, we're gonna have the highest standards, and then nobody would let them move away from that. So I don't see any sign of that going into a more flexible place at the moment. And then your last question is really an interesting question, whether it really made any difference. I'll tell you one place it made a difference, which was it ended up costing the taxpayers a non-trivial amount of money because, oddly enough, we couldn't hire anybody who knew anything, and I say that in shorthand, so what we had to do was we had to hire outside consultants at enormous costs to do what we could have hired people at government wages to do, but we weren't allowed to. And those people were not subject to any conflict of interest rules. So it's just one of these sort of Alice in Wonderland aspects of the government where you scratch your head and say, so we're going to pay this consulting firm $1 million or $2 million to do what somebody would have done, for $120,000 a year, but we can't hire that person. But these people don't have any restrictions on what other clients they might have or what their financial interests are or anything. And it's just one of those things where you kind of recognize that you get the good and the bad with government, and this is one of the unfortunate parts. So I don't know that it actually changed the outcome. It certainly changed the process of getting to the outcome, and we could have done it probably a little faster and a little more surgically if we'd had people in-house from the beginning who really knew this stuff as well as our outsiders did. So I thought I was being hired to take care of GM and Chrysler, and I got there and I found I had GM and Chrysler. I then had GMAC, now called Ally, and Chrysler Financial, because I learned of course, being completely ignorant about autos, I had no idea how important the finance companies were to the auto companies, so I had them. Then I discovered there were all these suppliers, and I had them. Then I would get visits from like the rental car companies, which had a huge set of problems around what was happening with the auto business. So I ended up finding out that we had a much bigger portfolio than I thought. The suppliers were part of it. And we did ultimately do a small supplier. We spent an enormous amount of time. It was actually the first thing we did, trying to figure out what to do about the suppliers, because they had gotten no money under the Bush administration. So they were in just as bad shape as GM and Chrysler, but they had received no federal money. So they were really at death's door when we showed up. And we spent an enormous amount of time on this. And there's one of my favorite scenes in this book was when we went to Larry, who really is as centrist and as free market a government servant and economist as there is, just hated the idea of one extra bit of government intervention that wasn't completely necessary. And we showed up in Larry's office and we had this whole elaborate plan for how we were going to save the suppliers. And Larry said, look, we're already in Vietnam. if you want to fire some missiles into Cambodia, I understand that, but we're not invading Laos. And so our grand supplier plan, that was the end of that. And we ended up doing a very modest guarantee of their receivables, which ended up not even being used that much. But, and this was more probably luck than brains. It worked. The suppliers ended up managing to get through the bad period. The private markets opened up. They went through normal bankruptcy, and they came out the other side, and actually have done pretty well since then. The other challenge we had dealing with a lot of the auto sector, but I'll mention it here, and if people are interested, sounds like there's a better party next door. We can talk more about it. There's a real question about what is an American company anymore, because these are global companies, most of them. And I mention this because of Delphi, which had been in bankruptcy for 3 years. For those of you who don't know Delphi, and I barely knew Delphi before I got there, Delphi was part of GM until 1999. It was their parts company. It's a huge company in its own right. GM had spun it off. It's as an American a company as there is. It's based in Troy, Michigan. It's been around for 100 years. They came in to see us, a bunch of executives who were good, stout Midwesterners and all that. And they came in and they said, we need help, we need help. And I was sitting there listening to all this. And then suddenly it hit me and I said, how many people do you employ? And they said, don't hold me to these numbers. They said 130,000. And I said, how many of them work in the US? And they said 15,000. So Delphi had quietly, slowly, had outsourced 90% of its workforce to Mexico, to China, to Thailand, to all sorts of other places. And I said, look, this meeting is over. We can't help a company 90% of whose employees are outside of the United States. So that was another complexity of this whole job, was where were American taxpayer dollars actually going? So the question is, essentially, if you don't mind my summarizing it, is what about next generation vehicles, and do we think about environmental and future technologies and things like that? And so I'm going to give you an answer you won't like, which is no. And the reason was, and I was really happy about that, because I didn't believe that we could effectively try to accomplish more than one objective. Our objective was to save these companies, not to change the nature of transportation in America. And happily, that was the president's view, that we would not use rescuing these companies to achieve any other policy objectives, whether it be environmental or labor or financing or anything. And we only were trying to achieve one objective. And I think it would have been a mistake. I think we ended up investing $82 billion of all of your money in this sector. And this was not intended as a future technology program. It was not intended as a welfare program. It was intended as a save these companies and jobs program. And I think it would have been badly diluted if we had tried to achieve more than one objective. The other thing I'll say that you also may not like is, we went out, I drove the Volt, we did all that, the press loved it. It was like the thing they thought was most interesting, what was the Volt like? The Volt may or may not be very successful. All these other things may or may not be very successful. None of them are going to make any material difference in the finances of these companies in the next 5 years, which is as far ahead as I can see, or as we ever look at in Wall Street in terms of how you think about whether you're going to get your money back and stuff. These are all important things for the country to do. There's a lot of money being spent elsewhere in the stimulus program. There's a program in the Department of Energy called Section 136, which is a $25 billion loan program for new technologies. There are a lot of other places in the government where they're trying to address exactly the things that you're concerned about, but I think it's appropriate they be kept separate. We didn't ask the Department of Energy to save our companies, and they shouldn't ask us to develop new technologies. That was my view. Some of the money we put in went in the form of debt. Some went in the form of equity, stock. The stock will be worth what it's worth. I think we will get most, if not all of that back. But the government, look, this was a case to address one question I probably won't get asked here, but I get asked in New York a lot. Did everybody sacrifice? I mean, was there real sacrifice? And yeah, the shareholders of these companies were wiped out. A lot of the suppliers did end up losing some money. Lots of people lost their jobs, and there was a lot of sacrifice, and the government is going to get most of its money back for it. Those are good questions. The question is, how much of their problems were, just to summarize it, were in effect self-inflicted, and how many of them were third-party or exogenous forces that were beyond their control, and do I see them getting in trouble again? So Rick Wagner in November of 2008, when he first testified in front of Congress and they flew into 3 separate planes and got in all that trouble for it, he had a very pithy, concise paragraph in his speech in which he said, the problem here is not one of our making. We've done everything right. We've done everything we should have done. The problem is the yen exchange rate, gasoline prices, the credit crisis, and the UAW, basically. And those were all problems, but they are only part of the story. The other part of the story is a story of management or lack of management or mismanagement. And the best way I know of to prove that or convince people of that is to compare GM and Ford. GM and Ford, very similar companies. Ford's a little smaller. They're both global. They've both been around 100 years. They're both in Detroit area. They both have the same challenge. Those 4 challenges they both face, right? They have the same UAW contracts. They're the same gasoline prices. And yet Ford didn't go bankrupt. Ford didn't run out of money. Why? Because I think Ford's management was more on the game. They had brought in a new CEO from outside of the industry, something that was very unusual in Detroit, and he did a great job, Alan Mulally. They had been less complacent, less arrogant, whatever you want to call it, about the future, and had borrowed a lot of money to make sure they had adequate cash reserves, where GM was kind of in a little bit of la-la land about things are going to work out. And so Ford got through it without going bankrupt. And as we sit here today, Ford's profit margins, GM is making money, as I said, but Ford's profit margins are twice that of GM, roughly on an operating basis in North America, and that's because they're more tightly managed. So I think it's some of both, but I don't think it's just all these outside forces. I think management really does make a huge difference.
And do you foresee
Oh, sorry, yes, the rest of your question. I would never say never, and as I said, you can't really look forward too far and be sure. But what I tried to say before is that the president really gave us the support to do fundamental restructurings of these companies. And so, as I said, we were pretty ruthless about it. And so GM's break-even point went from 16 million car sales across the whole country to 10 or 11 million. So there's no reason why GM should not make money in any normal car environment. As I said before, right now we're selling about 11.8 million cars a year. But simply to replace the cars that are out there and to take account of new drivers, you need to sell 15 million cars a year. And so people can postpone buying cars for a while, but they can't postpone buying them forever. Nobody's invented a substitute for the automobile, whatever they're powered by. And so I believe we will sell 15 million plus cars again a year in this country, probably relatively soon. And GM should make a ton of money at those levels. And so assuming that they continue to be well managed and they continue to have good corporate governance, they had terrible corporate governance, and we put in all new boards and things in these companies, then they should do fine. I can't look ahead 20 years. I mean, the last Chrysler bailout was 30 years ago. I can't look ahead that far, but there's no reason why they should get in trouble again. The question is, what lessons can we learn from what we did to save the entitlement programs of the government? That's a great question. I think there are I hadn't thought about this question. I haven't been asked for. I think there probably are some lessons which are that you have to be brutally candid and honest about the nature of the problems and deal with them in a forthright way and not try to put a Band-Aid on them, not try to dance around them, not try to avoid it. And the problem with our entitlements programs very fundamentally we've committed to a level of benefits that is wildly beyond the level of revenue that we're raising to pay for them. I don't think the entitlements programs are badly managed the way GM was badly managed. I think most people would tell you that Medicare and Social Security are actually pretty well managed in terms of the cost of those programs relative to the benefits, the overheads, and things like that. The problem is that we went from a system where when President Roosevelt put Social Security in place and President Johnson put Medicare in place, the concept was that they were to be self-funding and your Social Security taxes and your Medicare taxes were supposed to pay for them. We've gotten to a place where everybody gave that up. And when President Bush and the Congress put the prescription what's called Part D of Medicare, the prescription drug entitlement in place, they didn't pay for a penny of it. They just sort of created this benefit with no revenue, no obligation on the part of people to pay for it. And I think we're living in a time in this country where people want a free lunch. If you read, for example, not to pick on them, but if you read the Republican campaign platform for this election, they want to maintain all the taxes where they are now. They want no tax increases. They're in favor of some limited spending increases like on earmarks, which I think are something like $80 billion a year. It's some rounding error in a $1.3 trillion budget deficit. And they don't want to cut any entitlement program. Well, those numbers don't work. They just don't work. So the difference between what we were able to do and the entitlement problem is, as I said before, we were able to do what we did because we had TARP without going to the Congress. To do anything with entitlements, you have to go to the Congress, and there's no appetite in the Congress to take on any tough choices, and that's a very worrying thing. We met with all of them. Sorry, the question is, how did we determine who to meet with in the course of our work? Actually, because we didn't know anything, we actually sought out a lot of these people, and we did what on Wall Street what we would call due diligence. We basically asked every expert to come in and tell us what they knew, tell us their thoughts. And we just had a relatively interminable series of meetings to try to get up to speed really, really quickly. But I think that pretty much, hard to think of a case where we really turned down a meeting. We might sort of shunt it off to another group or something, or some of my more junior colleagues if we really thought it was going to be a waste of time. But, look, I really did, our view really was we were public servants. We had an obligation, anyone who had a legitimate stake in the situation, we had an obligation to hear them out. I think, interestingly, one aspect of being in the government is that they understood, Rahm Emanuel's famous phrase, never let a crisis go to waste. And that was a key element of how this worked, by the way. People knew that we were under the gun. They knew the pressure we were under. They were actually pretty courteous about wanting to come in and get a shot at us, but then not hounding us, not asking for meeting after meeting. And so that worked out pretty well. We had people on the Hill who insisted that we meet with this constituent group or that. I had several meetings with people who wanted to buy Hummer and make electric Hummers, if you can believe it. But it was an important senator who wanted us to do it, and so we did it. But for the most part, we were actually able to go about our business without too much wasted effort. So the question is, are there things I would have done differently, specifically cash for clunkers, or the way we treated different creditors and stakeholders? First, with respect to cash for clunkers, that was actually didn't come out of our $82 billion. That was a congressional program that we supported, as I read from that passage. We proposed it and Congress passed it. It was an unbelievably successful program. People will say, oh, it just brought forward sales that would have happened later. Well, sure. I mean, what was the whole stimulus program but bringing forward spending that would have happened later? That's the whole idea of what stimulus is. And in fact, when car sales, I think, went up to 14 million, if I remember correctly, in July of 2009, they didn't drop off nearly as much after that as a lot of us thought they would. So it was probably less brought forward than we would have guessed. But it generated a huge amount of demand at a very low cost. It was a couple $1 billion compared to a $787 billion stimulus program. So I think I thought it was a great program, and I was for it, and I think the demand was huge. In terms of the creditors, this is like a whole nother evening of discussion about creditors. The short answer is that people focus on how much the UAW got relative to the banks, in Chrysler particularly. Let me give you the short version of this, and I'm happy to carry on if it's a broader subject of interest. First, every single stakeholder got more than they would have gotten in a liquidation. The banks in Chrysler got $2 billion out of the $6.9 billion that they were owed. If Chrysler had liquidated, which we came that close to having happen, that close, it was the toughest decision we made, the banks would have gotten maybe $1 billion on a good day, maybe. And as one of the bankers said to me just the other day, he said, my problem is not how much we got, my problem is what the other people got. Well, frankly, what the other people got is really not a lot of his business. That was the government's decision because we felt that we needed these workers to come to work. This was not a case where you could hire replacement workers. We needed the UAW, and so we needed them to be willing to show up. And people who compare the banks to the union forget something very important. The union took a significant haircut. Our view was the union took about a 40% haircut on their future health care benefits, which is the matter that was at issue. But when you buy a Chrysler car, you get a 5-year warranty or a 7-year warranty, whatever you get. You're also a creditor of Chrysler. And if Chrysler goes out of business, your warranty isn't going to get serviced. We gave warranty holders 100 cents on the dollar. We guaranteed their warranties completely because we knew that if we didn't, people would stop buying Chrysler cars. And so we did what we had to do to keep Chrysler going. And so, the banks should be, if the banks really want to draw a comparison, they should say, well, why did we get 30 cents on the dollar and warranty holders got 100 cents on the dollar? Because you need warranty holders. And the same is true with the UAW. So I don't think that was unfair. As I look back on it, and I say this at the end of the book, if we had had more time, if we had not been in the government, I might have personally been in favor of asking every stakeholder to sacrifice a little bit more, because these were companies that were at death's door, and it's not unusual in that situation for people to take perhaps even bigger haircuts. This is going to work out fine, but I think maybe everybody got a little bit, like the banks getting twice what they would have got in liquidation. I think everybody maybe got a little bit more than you'd ideally like to do if you had more time and weren't the government. So the question is, we left them well positioned from a capital structure point of view. How did we leave them from an operational point of view, culture, management? It actually wasn't outside our purview. We felt that if we were going to restructure these companies, we were going to restructure them top to bottom. It's important to understand that Chrysler and GM had very different pluses and strengths and weaknesses, and they were almost mirror images of each other. GM had a not terrible product pipeline and set of products. Their products had gotten a lot better and were better than most people gave them credit for, but they had all the management problems that I talked about before, as well as just terrible cultural problems. Very slow moving, very bureaucratic, very sort of get along, go along kind of mentality. Chrysler had a very scrappy management team, a very close to the ground kind of management culture, terrible products. They had not one car that was on the Consumer Reports recommended list. So they were almost mirror images. And so our solution was mirror image solutions in a sense. In the case of Chrysler, we negotiated this alliance with Fiat to bring in the Fiat products. Fiat had been very successful. We also got Fiat's management, which was quite good. But the Fiat 500 is coming this fall, which is a small car from Fiat, and a lot of their advanced powertrain technology and things like that. And so Chrysler has been, from a culture and a governance point of view, Chrysler's been great from the time it went out of bankruptcy. It's doing just fine. Products, we have to wait and see how the products are. GM is the opposite. We obviously asked Rick Wagner to leave. Fritz Anderson came in. That didn't work out. The board asked him to leave. Ed Whittaker took the job for a while. He decided he'd had enough. Now we have Dan Akerson. The board has spent an enormous amount of time there trying to fix the culture. We insisted on boards that were really distinguished private sector people, regardless of political party, regardless of anything. And the board has been terrific. I think the new CEO, Dan Akerson, is terrific, and I think a lot of that culture has changed. And so we very much, again, if you read the book, you'll see that we spent an enormous amount of time worrying about GM's culture and how to make sure that when we left, it didn't revert back to its earlier ways. And I think by virtue of these new boards, I think we've done it. The most rewarding, surprising, and disappointing aspects of what I did. This is my first book stop. No, I'm being truthful. I'm just saying that if this were the end of my book tour instead of the beginning, I'd have these answers all prepared, but I haven't been asked a lot of these questions before. No, I'll be truthful with you. The most rewarding, I guess, has to be simply that we were able to do this and that it worked and that we got so much right, some of it by luck. For example, the decision on the suppliers could have ended very badly. I think that was as much luck as brains, and that the world did improve and the suppliers were able to come out of it and so forth without any real damage. But as I said, as I look back on this, and in all honesty, even as I look back now, a year and a half later, almost 2 years later, I can talk about things at the margin I might do differently, but I'm amazed, honestly amazed, and I don't take this credit myself. I had a really great team that in the time we were pressure we were under, with the number of people we had, they were able to get as much right as we got right. Normally, as I said, an investment bank would have 50 people spending a year or two to try to figure this out, and we didn't have that. And I think it's really the 90-10 rule. You can accomplish 90% of what you might ultimately accomplish with 10% of the time, kind of the way Warren Buffett buys companies and things like that. So that was the most rewarding. The most disappointing, I would say, I didn't really have a lot of disappointments. I say in the book that I wish we had taken on the UAW pension plan. I think that they had this incredible health care plan, which has been more or less addressed, but the pension plan is still far more generous than pretty much any company in America has anymore. And look, it's a sad, I guess here's the most disappointing thing. The most disappointing thing is that we have a huge competitive problem in manufacturing in this country because of globalization. If the existing UAW workers at GM and Chrysler have a base wage of $28 an hour, the Japanese companies in the South pay about $24 an hour. In Mexico, GM pays $7 an hour. In China, it pays $4.50 an hour. In India, it pays $1 an hour. And if you ask the GM people, they will tell you that their plants in Mexico are just as productive as their plants in the U.S. and it's a real conundrum. It's very hard to see where that movie ends happily for American manufacturing, and I couldn't solve it. My successor, Ron Bloom, has stayed on to try to solve it, but he would tell you it's a really tough one. What was your third thing? The most surprising thing was General Motors. The most surprising thing was getting into General Motors, a company that, when I was growing up on Wall Street, had the most revered finance group in America practically. The GM building was filled with GM Treasury people, and they were all thought of as, really top-notch. The company, was obviously, the company at one point I think was 4% of American GDP or something like that. Some huge behemoth of a company with 50% market share in the U.S. And to get in there and see, it was, as I say in the book, it was one of the worst finance. Just take finance, which is something I feel more comfortable judging than I do manufacturing or some other part of the business. It was one of the worst finance, if not, it was probably the worst finance group of any major company I'd ever seen in my life. They could not tell you on any given day within $500 million how much cash they had. And the result of which was that they needed to have $10 or $11 billion every day to operate, whereas a company of the same size should have had $5 or $6 billion only needed to operate, because they had cash sloshing all over the world and they just had no idea. And it was really stunning. It was really, really stunning and very disappointing. Okay, great.